Hello everyone and welcome to a new episode of the LSG2G podcast. Today we want to discuss how blockchain technology can be used to create new fundraising models and how it can be used to bridge the so-called biotech valley of death. We will also explore how these decentralized networks can be used to revolutionize biotech R&D and accelerate research. And this comes actually at an interesting time when in-house innovation at large pharmaceutical companies is slowing down and is relying more on cost-effective acquisitions of young companies who are pioneering new cutting-edge approaches rather than doing their own research. But because just to give you a few numbers, and mostly it is that out of like 10,000 pharmaceutical candidates that you will have on the plate, maybe 100 will look promising in chemical laboratory tests. Then maybe 10, if you're lucky, will actually then go on the clinical trial testing, and maybe one will then come to market. So you can already see that there is a lot of effort, a lot of costs involved in getting drugs to market. And we're super excited to have Paul Kohlhaas today with us, who is co-founder and CEO of Molecule. And we're super excited to hear about how or what Molecule's contribution could be to sort of accelerate research in pharma.
Yeah, absolutely. Astrid, thank you so much for the warm introduction. And Christian, thank you so much for the invitation on the podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today and share what we're working on.
You're welcome.
So, Paul, maybe you can tell us a little bit about, what Molecule is, what it does, and what your vision is going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Astrid, I think you did a great job in summarizing some of the big pain points, really, I think that we find in modern pharmaceutical development today. And so my journey into this topic started when I was still quite young. So I got very interested in biohacking during high school when I was like 17, 18, and found it really fascinating because in the biohacking community at the time you had really a flurry of new substances being explored. Many of them were kind of in like a gray area. And together with that, you had the emergence of strong online communities around these new substances. So telling like Reddit forums and other forums. And well, what I saw back then was that people were very openly and freely experimenting with these new substances in an open source way. And I found that really interesting. And at the same time, due to like a personal family friend of ours was affected by the opiate crisis in the US, I started looking at the other tail end of this, is like how does big pharma bring new therapeutics to market? And what are the underlying incentive mechanisms there? And back then, I kind of saw this massive divide between, okay, on the one side, there's increasingly open source drug development and the emergence of these communities. And on the other side, we have this extremely encrusted, very slow, very expensive pharmaceutical system that is often bringing therapeutics to market that don't necessarily really serve or help patients, as was, for example, and as continues to be the case with the opiate crisis in the US. After that, I then went into economics. So I got really interested in these macro effects, and then was studying economics in Switzerland. And during that time, first got into Bitcoin. So I was also trading biotech stocks. And then we had a small trading group. Within that trading group, someone introduced this notion of Bitcoin, and then became really, really interested in decentralized networks. And then spent a lot of my career after that. I briefly worked in private equity, started my first company when I was 23. Helping corporates understand the emerging blockchain ecosystem at the time, and then worked at Consensus, which is one of the largest blockchain development companies in the world. And as I was working at Consensus, did quite a bit of work on data marketplaces. So how can we develop systems that enable enterprises to share data, for example, with AI researchers? So really bringing marketplace thinking into that. And I spent quite a lot of time looking into Ocean Protocol, which is an emerging data marketplace, and had this aha moment where I realized, hey, a lot of these new incentive designs that were emerging could be reapplied to the pharmaceutical system. So our core thinking with Molecule is, what if pharma and biotech development became more like a marketplace? And if we look at the history of marketplaces, pretty much every business model that we have today, or like almost every industry, has been disrupted by marketplace technology. And I think pharma and biotech in that way is one of the last big pipeline business models. So in general, you can say there's two big business models that drive, let's say, our modern economy. One is a pipeline model where I take something from start to finish and then bring it to a customer. So let's say if I'm creating a taxi business, a pipeline model would be I'm going to buy all the cars, then I'm going to put out job ads to hire the drivers, and then I'm going to put out job ads for people to see that I have a taxi business to call me up, and then I send out the cab. So that's a pipeline model. And Uber came in, and yeah, we all know what happened next. And so pharma is really one of the last big pipeline models where assets are identified in the early stages and then move from step to step to step through different clinical stages until they can ultimately be marketed and commercialized. But every company does that by themselves. So everyone in the pharma industry or biotech is like digging for gold and not sharing information. And yeah, our guiding thinking coming into this was, what if pharma acted more like a marketplace where drugs could be collaboratively developed? And for us, kind of the key driver in enabling that collaboration is intellectual property and rethinking how intellectual property acts as a driver for innovation. Because with every marketplace, you have to ask yourself, what is the medium of exchange? What am I exchanging here? And for us, the core medium of exchange in that became IP, so patents. If you think about what a pharma company really has, they don't have much. They have mainly intangible assets, and they're valued for those intangible assets, which are patents. And yeah, maybe as a brief introduction.
That's great. So you sort of introduced also this notion of fractionalizing IP ownerships, and that you could actually do this via holding tokens. So how would that work on the Molecule platform?
Yeah, absolutely. So going into this marketplace thinking, we asked ourselves, what would happen if patents became shared assets? So today, if you think about a patent is really a monopoly. So one company owns a patent, and it means they have the monopoly to commercialize and price that asset for a given time period. And that's justified with obviously the high expenses in R&D to actually take the risk to research that asset and bring it to market. And we simply said, what would happen if we fractionalized ownership of IP in the same way that we fractionalize ownership in companies? So of course I can hold a company 100% myself if that's the way I want to run a company. But we've seen, I mean, through the emergence of stock markets, that having shared ownership of companies creates a flurry of incentives. In the same way that if I have a startup, I benefit a lot from giving equity to other people who then help me collaborate, develop it together. And so we thought, if we move patents out of companies and then enable a shared ownership structure, that would enable people to collaboratively develop a drug together. Now, that could, for example, look in a way, let's say a biotech decides to use our platform and spins one of their assets onto our system. They can then say, cool, now we're giving 10% of the asset to our key research partner. And we're going to give 2% for whoever can do toxicology reports. We're going to give another 10% to investors that want to come and invest purely into that asset. And that actually plays into a trend that has really accelerated in the biotech space over the past 10 to 20 years, which is called asset-based financing. So already today, many biotech companies will spin out assets and then raise financing purely for that asset. And what you're really doing through that is you're creating a much more granular R&D system. Whereas, for example, if I'm investing in a biotech company, I'm investing in 10, 20 assets that they might be developing, and maybe one or two of them are successful. And so our thinking there also enables much more granularity in terms of how you pick and choose what you would ultimately invest in or contribute your time into. And I think tokenization in that sense has really ushered in a completely new technical feasibility around how we can fractionalize assets and share ownership. And that's why we also believe the time is really ripe for the solution that we're proposing. Because ultimately, the system that we want to develop, it could be, you could have a researcher from the University of Peru upload a molecule to a system. We then fractionalize ownership in that. And as a next step, you could have an investor from Singapore come in and say, I've been looking exactly for this molecule because we have a similar thesis here and here and here, and I want to finance this. And this is something that previously would be completely impossible. Imagine wanting to list one of these assets on a stock exchange, on a national stock exchange. That's just something from a regulatory perspective is a non-starter. And that's why we also really feel that tokenization really enables this new global connectivity.
And how will this price will then be determined of the token or the underlying assets? How should that work?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways to value assets in the biotech space. I mean, this isn't something new. It's like if company A, like let's say if a company acquires an asset out of a university, there's known pricing methods in the biotech space that you can apply to that. However, I think this tokenization approach also solves a really dominant problem in the industry, which is it's extremely hard to price IP, especially in early stage drug development, when you know an asset could potentially become worth billions of dollars, but currently the data for that is lacking. Pricing IP is very hard, and IP itself as an asset has been very illiquid. Tokens in that sense, and really the free markets that tokens enable for, in our opinion, much more better pricing functions for the underlying IP. Now, from a technical perspective, there's really interesting pricing models that have emerged in the crypto and blockchain ecosystem. One of them are automated market makers. So that's something where we've invested quite heavily in developing kind of algorithms that make it much easier to price these assets from the get-go. And then the other thing that we're working hard on is kind of standardizing early stage IP kind of pricing mechanisms. So I think once a biotech company reaches Series A stage and the data is a little bit more clear, it becomes much more easy to price. But the assets that we're really focusing on are preclinical assets that either reside in academia or very early stage biotech companies. And those are also the assets that, like big pharma, which is ultimately still a buyer, is most interested in. Using these new mechanisms to create more liquidity in that phase, we believe would be hugely beneficial to accelerating research in that stage. And maybe to come to the title of the podcast, that's really where the Valley of Death is most prominent. Translating discoveries out of academia and translating discoveries in early stage biotechs into the clinic.
Cool. I think that in previous talks, you always spoke also about the possibility that if someone, for example, publishes positive data to an asset, that could potentially then raise the price. And if there is some negative data to it, then it will sort of decrease the price of an asset. Is this still in your model, or have you changed that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a model that is generally found in financial markets. If positive data emerges about a company, the price will go up. If negative data emerges about a company, the price is likely to go down. And that's just because traders are making very quick financial decisions and placing their bets accordingly. And we found this a really interesting notion as we began developing Molecule. And you have to kind of think our ultimate vision for Molecule is really to become like this thriving public stock market or exchange market for these super early stage assets. And something that we found really interesting is that this creates entirely new incentives for positive and negative data. Because negative data, with the current way that IP and patents are monopolized, negative data is not valuable. Let's say I'm a biotech company, we raised $20 million in funding, we've been researching, and we increasingly discover that our lead asset that we promised our investors just isn't working. And we don't really have an incentive to tell the world about that, because why would we tell the world that our drug that we've been researching and raised money on isn't working? And this creates really perverse incentives, because the next thing that we would try and do is probably still sell it off as something that might work and be great. And maybe we'll get a bigger pharma company to buy it. And then they buy it. And a lot of these kind of deals are based kind of on what I was thinking is like business development and M&A tactics that came up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Like we make a big M&A deal, we all win, and then Big Pharma takes the asset into the clinic, and in stage 2 clinical trials, they might realize it doesn't work. But this was already information that we might have discovered at the end of preclinical trials, but no one had an incentive to bring that out. Okay, so let's turn this around. Let's think if this asset was publicly traded in a community-like setup. So you have researchers working on there. There's still a company that's invested. There's numerous investors. And let's say the asset is just gaining and gaining in price, similar to the, let's say, the mania that we've recently witnessed in the cryptocurrency markets. And let's say I'm a research team at MIT, and I'm like, you know what? We've looked at a similar compound structure for this indication, and we think it's going to be toxic here and here, and it's not. That's why it's not going to work. But now this publicly traded asset is almost like a bounty. It's almost like a pool of money that's sitting there, because if we can prove that most people in the market are wrong because the asset isn't, like this drug isn't going to work, then that's valuable financial information. So you could have these like scientists that now are incentivized to produce negative data to show that an asset might actually not work, and thus bring down the price again. And you could have market participants kind of go long and go short based on the data that is emerging around the asset. And you could say, okay, is this financialization? Is this a good thing? Because it can also feel kind of like it could be concerning. Personally, I would always say that it's a great thing if this negative data or positive data emerges as soon as possible, because if that keeps a big pharma company or anyone from buying the asset and then investing another 100, 200 million into getting it into stage 2 clinical trials, that saves massive costs for patients. Because ultimately, if a drug fails in stage 2 clinical trials, all of those costs are being offset to patients somewhere else. It means that somewhere else the price is going up. And so we hope through these new information incentive schemes that you can weed out bad candidates much more quickly, and that you massively increase the diversity of drug candidates. Yeah, sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
No, I think it's really fascinating. But the issue I have here is, so who decides if positive or negative data will actually be admitted as part of the valuation? And how do you then go about insider trading that could go along with that? Is it can you create a regulated market around it, or what is the thinking there?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question. I think a part of it will depend on, let's say, the researchers that are officially affiliated with the project. And we also need to be careful there with the incentive design around that, because if I'm a researcher that has a financial stake in an asset that I'm researching, I might be biased to show positive data. The implications for insider trading in these kind of setups are really interesting, I think, because in a way that we're intending to structure some of these like markets, you would essentially have you could have an open license to research the compound. And that means I could be completely unaffiliated and just start researching this thing and then publish about it. And then is the question, am I now gaining an edge on the market? If I'm researching something that is in the public domain and I'm creating data, is that really insider information? Because the lines there get quite blurry. It's kind of like if I think that the new Tesla model won't work, so I buy it, and then I guess I'm probably legally not allowed to open it. But let's say I was, and I discovered there was some fatal flaw, and then I wrote a blog about it, and that would now drive down the price. Is that insider trading? Yeah, so I think it gets quite interesting, and also we look a lot in what's happening in the blockchain and cryptocurrency space and the similarities there. For example, if I'm a developer in a public protocol and I discover a bug in the protocol, and I know that it's going to fail, but at the same time it's tied to this big price tag. And then there's also a question there: is that insider trading? Actually, I'm curious, Astrid, what would you think about that?
Oh, a tough one. I'm trying to get my head around it as well. I mean, I think one way is probably to make data just admissible to really recognized institutions like universities that are in this space. However, we know that there are always competing groups as well. So there might be an issue there. I think that it is a very interesting topic that one can even think one step further ahead, that one could actually use this also, or the molecular infrastructure also, to think about science as a whole, not just about a biopharmaceutical research project, but also how could you actually use this infrastructure, for example, peer reviewing processes. So I think there are some really fascinating applications there, but I think that's maybe something also along, I don't know, trial and error, or being sort of part of the molecule network as well. I mean, also thinking about, maybe that goes a little bit too deep maybe for this podcast, but also think about sort of staking mechanisms and how really people can actually think about governance in that kind of way. So I think there are definitely some options to explore there.
Interesting ideas. I'm working now in this field that you described since 2006, and there was just one thought popping up in my mind before we come to the business models and applications. When I think about China in December 2019, January 2020, when the Corona crisis started, I think the fish market in Wuhan was very well frequented by people. So many people went there and wanted to buy something. When the crisis started, it was shut down. So nobody went to the market and the market vanished. I think it was reopened somewhere else. The question that popped up in my mind while you were speaking is, I understand that you are creating a market. Why should I go there? What's the reason why, when I have a patent, why should I go to your market? Why? What benefits do I have? I mean, the problem that I see in the industry currently is I always find people to research. So just talking about the problems that I don't think that are problems in my mind, I always find somebody who helps me research. So there are many scientists in the world who are happy to get paid. So when I have investors and I can pay people, they are very willing to provide their insights. I think the scientific debate is ongoing. I'm not so much worried that there is too little debate. I'm more worried that the scientists debate too much, that they won't talk anymore with each other. So I think this is very well solved. Also, finding negative truths happens very often. The thing that really blocks the development of many drugs is really a lack of money in this valley of death. That investors, let's say the professional venture capitalists, they see too much risk in this area. The public funds don't want to have a state-owned IP landscape, and the business angels, the problem is it's just too many. So when I want to fund a project up to clinical phase 1, let's say we need about $5, $10, $15 million. Getting that out of the European business angel community creates a cap table with hundreds of people, basically. Where exactly is your infrastructure in that picture fitting in?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to phrase this like, why come to our platform as let's say as a researcher who has an interesting innovation, because obviously there's very different incentives on the investor side or on whoever wants to contribute to these markets. And then you said it 100% correct. I think the biggest bottleneck at the moment in this stage is funding. And I also think access to networks and resources. If you're a researcher today that isn't in one of the big biohubs like Boston or San Francisco, or Oxford, it's very hard to get access to funding. It's super hard to even figure out how to get there if you're not a biotech executive who's done this 5 or 10 times. And you often actually see that in like the executives that run biotech companies, that this is their like 10th or 15th rodeo. But I think for young biotech founders, that landscape is incredibly hard. But it's a huge shame, and it's a massive missed opportunity, because there is so much innovation that we're just not enabling. The emergence around. And then the other thing is, I have interesting conversations sometimes with biotech VCs who are like, look, a ticket size under 5 million just doesn't make sense for us. The risk is too big. You won't get anywhere. And we have this complete opposite stance. We're like, look, if we make the processes more efficient, we can build, and this is really our model, build virtual pharma companies, or build these virtual biotech companies that operate, and this is an increasing trend in general, that operate, let's say you have two researchers at University of Basel, you have one researcher in the US, we're bringing them together through like a shared ownership vehicle, and then we can give access to that vehicle to an investor in who isn't like tied anymore to a geographic investment location, but you can kind of build a global cap table. And the stage that we're specifically focusing on is where we see the biggest gap, which is in pre-seed funding. So supporting, and this is kind of where grant funding typically stops, or grant funding gets really hard, and seed funding isn't available yet. But it's also where there's the biggest amount of compounds and innovation, really. Yeah, and so at the moment we focus on, let's say, investment amounts between 100,000 up to a few million. We're not really going into that seed stage yet, just because the type of it gets very different, because then you're already dealing with an existing company, a much larger team, and
so if I got it right, when we have a patent that's developed on the university, the researcher can access your platform to sell the patent via your platform. Is that the right picture?
Okay, so in the first step, what we're doing is we're gathering the information. So as a first step, you can kind of come to our platform and you can almost create like a LinkedIn profile for your research project, which now means you have different data fields that an investor would typically want to see. So the first thing that we're actually doing is we're forcing the researcher to adopt a different mindset and kind of put them into a framework like, look, these are the questions that you need to answer to even become interesting, because that's exactly what anyone wanting to buy this asset would be looking for. And then we start gauging interest in this asset. And from there, the next step would be looking at the IP, like what's the IP strategy around this asset? Is there a patent already? We actually like working with assets that don't have patents yet, because it allows us to do the patent strategy from scratch. And there we work with, for example, we work with legal counsel and IP attorneys in the US. And then we would take the asset, develop a strategy around it, and then move it into a special purpose vehicle, which could be just a Delaware LLC. So at this point, the researcher can get access to a cap table, access to an IP strategy. And then if we're saying, hey, let's actually make this asset investable now, we would move it into one of these virtual company setups. And at that point, there's a question, do we tokenize it and go more of a decentralized route? Or do we go like a securities route?
Let's go a little step backwards to really understand what you're doing. And if I'm too critical, Astrid, stop me. What you're telling is basically how the industry is set up. So we take an idea at the university, and it's a tech transfer process. So it's you support the researcher in defining the patent strategy, put the patent, then license it from the university into a special purpose vehicle. And this is standard. So this is happening already in the industry. Anywhere in the world, it doesn't matter if it's Shanghai, if it's Boston, if it's San Francisco, if it's in Vienna. This is the standard process. Where is now the blockchain technology? So
okay. So I think we need to unpack these things one step at a time. But so where the blockchain technology really becomes interesting is that we're moving this asset now onto a global network, and that's a massive game changer, because. So essentially, let's say the status quo would now be the asset stays in the special purpose vehicle, that entity sells shares, maybe one day it does an IPO, maybe it starts trading on an existing stock exchange. You can only give access to the vehicle to accredited investors, at least in the United States, which means you need to have a minimum income of 200K a year or over 1 million in assets. Boom. Like that's most of your research community and most of your patient groups. Anyone more democratic is gone. And so where blockchain technology really becomes interesting is you can restructure access to these assets, and you're moving them not onto, let's say, a NASDAQ, but you're moving them onto like a global platform. And then it becomes quite important to look at, is this a security? If it is a US registered security, then you still need to confirm, with certain regulations, but still even having it as a token makes it much more liquid, much more easily transferable. And many regulations in the US, including, have, for example, starting enabling smart contract-based share issuance systems. And on the other side, if you have a non-security-based model, your options in how you now design this as a financial asset are like almost unlimited. And what I mean with unlimited is you can create new governance structures where this token now takes a fundamental role in, for example, voting, how should we price the asset? So with tokens, for example, you can move shareholders out of passive roles into very active roles, taking very active roles in how the asset now is actually developed.
I think the problems that I see in the industry is, on one hand, is access to capital. I completely agree to that.
Yeah.
The second problem that I see is the cap table. So what I saw in the past is some companies who invited family, friends, and acquaintances to invest in the company directly in the SPV, which at the end of the day had hundreds of people, which makes it very challenging to engage a VC later in the process, because the negotiation process really lasts long. To coordinate 100 shareholders of a company in a limited shell. So these are two real problems that I see. What I understand from your speech right now is that you want to solve the access to the capital on one hand, so that you create a global network. If you solve that, it's great, because it's really a problem to get out of the way. But what I would like to understand better is the second thing, what you are doing with the money that flows to the company. But because basically it's what you're doing, you collect money and you dedicate it to the development of a molecule. The question I have is, how does that work, that we have a better infrastructure when we use your system than this standard process that happens that the people directly invest in the company? What is your, what is your USP here?
Yeah. I mean, I think first I want to preface this with saying we can't fix all of the world's problems. And I also think we as a company, we need to experiment a lot. I think one side we experiment with new models, and on the other side, we apply tried and tested methods. I think it's a fallacy to think you can reinvent the world, reinvent cap tables. But maybe to give a concrete example from a really interesting project that we're working with the University of Copenhagen in the longevity space. So we out-licensed an asset from them, and what we then do is we move that asset, as I mentioned, into one of these vehicles, and the research team that developed the asset is still working on it. So we out-license the asset into this vehicle, and then funds are raised into the vehicle, and then the research can commence. And so the research team in obviously before says, hey, these are the preclinical studies, these are the different steps that we're going to complete, these are the outcomes, and this is how much it's going to cost. And so once the capital starts flowing into the SPV then begins paying the research team. And the research team now starts delivering the data and showing that the asset is valuable. You could also outsource the research to another research team. I mean, this is also where CRO relationships become very interesting. And in these virtual pharma company setups where you have virtual pharma companies that already outsource 95% of their development. This
is pretty much standard. So this is like every company that I know and I'm aware of is working, that most of the work is outsourced. What we keep in the companies is the project management. Can we get a step back to how the money flows into the SPV? What is the unique position there? Because the standard process still is, I mean, when we found companies, let's take $1 million, for example, we invest $1 million in a company.
Yeah.
And then the company, the project management team starts working. It's pretty much standard, and the investors probably get, I would say, about 70%, 60, 50%, depends on the negotiation skills of both sides. Where do you make a difference here in the way that the money is flowing into the company? Because you said it's a tokenization of the process at this point. What's the difference in your process than the process that's already happening on the market?
I think the first difference in process is that there is no system today where you can scale this with. It's a similar thing where you could say, why are banking APIs a really interesting innovation? We had banking before, but these APIs make banking now extremely scalable to the point where I can just include an API on my website when I'm coding it and allow people to have a payment system. Of course, payment systems existed before. And so our hope is developing these frameworks and working with scientists that the process for them to set up companies and get them funded gets much more scalable and fast. So I think that's one innovation, just considering the processes around actually doing this. And you don't even need to bring blockchain or tokenization in there. So we also have setups where we say, hey, this is money going into a bank account and it's a normally set up company, and then shares are issued in that vehicle. If you bring tokenization in, the money flows get a lot more interesting. So then you're actually saying, so now you have this, you launch a project in this decentralized network, and you tie, for example, we tie the IP ownership to now ownership of tokens on this network. And now investors that are also on the network can contribute capital within seconds. So you could launch a fundraising event, and if there is enough demand, within seconds, the thing would be sold out and you have the money. And within like 5 minutes, if you wanted to, you could send it to the researcher. And so the speed, I think the speed of capital flows and also the liquidity that we're seeing emerging in blockchain and tokenized networks is enormous. I mean, for most networks, and even so there's a big decentralized exchange ecosystem that's growing. And we also hope that the tokens that we're creating from these projects can be plugged into these decentralized exchanges. So, I mean, and these protocols have seen
I'm 46. I'm an old man.
But I should also maybe add just, one point here, also from the blockchain space. And for example, why our fund is predominantly investing into tokenized assets. And this is also one of the reasons that it's easier to manage. You can get out of it much easier than with equity, for example, because with equity, as you appreciate, there are certain also rules and regulations that go with it, certain processes. If you want to get out, if you want to sell your shares, sometimes it can take years and years and years and years until you can actually get out of it again. With tokenized assets, transferring this ownership actually gets much easier. I mean, if we're speaking about this kind of non-fungible tokens, which we would be applying to Molecule, then obviously it gets a little bit more difficult, but still much easier than equity. So I think in that sense, there is a great innovation in achieving that, for example, if an investor says, well, okay, I really have just an investment horizon of 2 to 3 years and I would like to see a profit, then with tokens, theoretically, this would be achievable. With shareholding, it would be really difficult. And also, this is something that we see in our own portfolio, that actually the high profits are in the tokenized assets, and also the route getting out of all these assets now and closing down the first fund is actually much more difficult with all our equity holdings versus our token holdings, just as a defense.
I completely agree to what you say, Astrid and Paul. I slowly understand where you're aiming at, which probably is related to my age. With 46, I can proudly say I'm an old man. But let's stop a little bit here and dig a little bit deeper into that part, because I think this is probably the most critical part of your project. Investing in a drug development company today means you never get out. So when a business angel invests money in a drug development company, meaning developing therapeutics, it's a process that lasts still 10 to 15 years, even if it's COVID. So also on the therapeutic side, there are limitations. We need to do a lot of studies until a product gets to the market. The early stage investors, basically cannot sell their shares because there are no buyers on the market who want to purchase shares. The behavior of the VCs is that the VC invests in a special phase of the development, like clinical phase 1 or clinical phase 2, to move the project forward, but not to pay out the business angels. So I think this is the key problem here. What I understand from your explanation is that you make this phase where business angels want to invest much more transferable, so that it might create a novel market that doesn't exist yet. Did I get this right?
Yeah. So something that you said, so for example, we're talking a lot about VCs and business angels, but like, what if researchers could invest? And like, what if patients could invest? Like, what if you had a new diabetic treatment that was funded by patients? And I think that's for us, that's a complete mind shift. And I think it's for our team as well, it's one of the biggest motivators. I think there is the potential here to create an entirely new market. And I think it really hits the nerve of time, because you like over the past year, I think we've seen an explosion of investment communities with retail people that are investing through apps like Robinhood. There's a huge rise in really getting access and bringing that access much earlier downstream, which has actually been entirely reserved to people like industry insiders and biotech VCs that really are the only ones to really invest at that stage at the moment. And I think democratizing that access is a really, really interesting thing in itself. And then I wanted to add something to what Astrid said, just in terms of why I think tokens are really interesting are their composability. So with shares, I can't really do that much. But say if I have tokenized assets, let's say I take a basket of 5 longevity drugs, and I can now put them into a fund. And this is almost like a mini ETF. And using blockchain, I can do that within a day or two and launch it. And in the current financial world, that would be insane. But on blockchain, it works. There's obviously numerous regulatory considerations that one needs to make when combining these assets in that way. But from a technical perspective, it's very simple to do. And so that's another cool thing for us. So let's say, for example, we gather 5 to 10 super early stage longevity projects from universities, and then we say, cool, we're going to bundle them into this mini ETF. And then if you don't know the science that well, you can just say, cool, well, I want to invest some money into super early stage longevity. Let me put 5,000 euros into this basket. And so these are some of the next layer innovations that we can start building in. But that just creates so much more possibilities than what is really possible today.
How does actually the onboarding process look like for a project? So let's say I'm a researcher now, and I'd be really interested to put something on the molecule data marketplace. So how would that actually work? So what kind of information do I need to provide, and how do you screen these opportunities?
Yeah. In the early stages, it's quite similar to a grant application, where you kind of have to, you detail what your research outputs are. You would detail what the current stage is, how much funding you might require, and then ideally what the commercial opportunity is. We have to turn down quite a lot of researchers when we just realize, hey, this is still in the basic research phase and it's quite unclear what the IP strategy around this is. And that's really, I think, a core decision-making factor for us, looking at, is there valuable IP here, or can we turn this into valuable IP? And then we work with advisors in different therapeutic areas. We've tried to kind of narrow down in specific therapeutic areas and build network effects there, as opposed to trying to go into go into many different areas. And then we begin, even before we take a project live, we begin kind of testing investor interest around this. But in one way, it's quite easy actually to get your project listed initially if you can kind of complete this initial data, but it's much more hard, or our funnel is still quite tight when it then actually comes to financing them, because doing these financings event is much more intensive than just collecting research projects at first.
So basically you are not only putting any project on your platform, so you are doing a proper due diligence process initially. You support the scientists in defining the patent strategy, also test the market with investors and advisors and see if it really does make sense to sell this asset on your platform. Is that the right understanding?
Yeah, that's the right understanding.
That's a cool thing.
It's something that we.
That's a great thing. That's a great thing actually, because it solves one problem. So especially when, let's say, investors want to invest via your platform that are not proficient in the field, so they get a risk-assessed asset, and it's not just someone doing, and what was the term, ICO? Someone is issuing an ICO, but there is a professional team behind it who looks at it if this project really can end up in a product at the end of the day.
Yeah, and we have to do that initially, because I think we should ensure that the project that launched through our system initially can really be successful. I think over time, the merit in the system will really be by making it completely open. Because if we get more and more into a role of due diligencing the assets, it changes our business model, because then we're acting more like a biotech VC ourselves. And our team, the strength of our team is in creating like networks or platforms, not necessarily in being the best to pick biotech investments. Otherwise, we should maybe make a biotech VC if we're really good at that. And the other thing that I find really interesting is, I think if you made the system maximally open, the system starts self-selecting. And I think it's very difficult to judge very early stage biotech innovation or drug candidates. Because it's really like it could be this, it could be this. But I think by allowing a big diversity, we can get much better end results. And our hope is over time that we get something similar that we've seen in the open source communities, that you really have the development of a self-selecting community that starts helping researchers bring assets through the system, and also self-selects and regulates what is good and what isn't.
Let's put it in a practical example. So if I get an asset that I want to put in a company, and I need investors, so I can go to your platform, and then we sit together with your team, and the team decides, does it make sense at this point in time, or doesn't it make sense? Let's assume we come to the conclusion it does make sense. And we are lucky, we find investors, let's say 3 million. Is it possible to raise 3 million at your platform? And we find that then what they get is basically tokens. So it's like Bitcoin, or is it something that I understood wrong? So you get a transferable thing like cryptocurrency. Is that the right understanding?
Kind of, in a way, yeah. I mean, I think tokens are misunderstood to some degree, because many of them, so I think, there's three main categories of tokens. One is a payment token. Bitcoin is a payment token. Like the euro is also a payment token. Then the second one are asset tokens. So these are tokens that are typically tied to a real world asset and normally a security, which is then a share. So now you're just saying it's just digital share certificates. And then the third is really the most interesting area, are utility tokens. And based on what type of project and what type of setup we're going for, you would either receive a security token or a utility token. Personally, I think so. For example, there's a concept which is really garnered a lot of, let's say, attention and acceleration over the past 2-3 years, is a concept called DAOs. So these are decentralized autonomous organizations. And one setup that is really interesting for us is actually to place the ownership of the IP itself into the custodianship of a DAO. And instead of making it a pure security token, make it a utility token. And now you create a community around this asset that collectively needs to develop it and drive it forward. But that's a complete paradigm shift to the current investment landscape. And also something that's like, I think that'll take time until the world's ready for it.
So instead of owning a share of a company, I own a digital asset. Okay. Which I mean, I think the SPV will probably be like a limited company, or which solves actually, I think, a real problem, because it's always tricky as an early stage investor to sell then whatever assets the investor gets in the current situation. So what I understand from your speech is that with your solution, it solves the transferability of the ownership of a part of the company. So when a business angel, for example, or a patient decides to get out of the investment, it's an additional chance. So this person can sell to a professional investor, to a VC, and can approach them, or can go back to your platform and try to find other business angels or other patients or other researchers who want to buy the token. So in case there is liquidity on your market. But it's I think slowly I understand what.
So on the one side, let's say if it's a security, so securities often have quite restrictive transfer regulations, so you can't just like give it to anyone. But let's say you do find someone who buys them, and let's say that's fully regulated, then you could just sell to someone else and transfer the token. What's really interesting is once you start seeing secondary markets around these things, and that's again where I think this decentralized exchange system that's coming up on networks like Ethereum is super interesting. The secondary market means essentially now every day your token is being traded by other people. So whenever you want to sell it, first of all, you always have a market price in the same way that there's a market price for any company listed on the stock exchange. And there's always liquidity. So when you want to exit, you can exit at the current market price without ever thinking, okay, who's going to buy this or what am I doing with it? It's the same way if you sell your shares in a public company, you don't consider who's going to buy them.
How would it fit in the standard process? So when I think a little bit further, we got a patent, we put it in an SPV, we got it financed via your platform.
Yeah.
And it really works. And we find out that this molecule has the potential to become a platform technology, which means you can do something in various indications. So you can treat, let's say it's the wonder thing that treats everything, but it needs more money. You get rich, you get beautiful, and you get healthy. So all three important parts in life. But the thing is, we need 500 million euros for that, and let's assume we cannot raise it via your platform anymore because it's beyond this early stage. What is the handover point? How does it work then to get the traditional VC landscape into such a company? What are your thoughts behind that?
So we've been thinking about this quite a lot, and really from the earliest days, and this then goes into like, we've talked a lot about the supply side. So marketplaces always have two sides. There's the supply side and the demand side. So we talked a lot about the supply side. This is really going into the demand side. And then the early demand side is obviously really investors, speculators that think this thing might work. And if it works, then it's going to appreciate in value. But then the question is, how would any of this actually come to market? And we believe that if we can accelerate candidates like you just described, there is going to be huge inherent market interest, obviously, in acquiring them. I think the most competitive part of the biopharma game is M&A, is like finding these assets as early as possible and acquiring them and getting them into your own pipeline. And so Molecule, in that sense, really becomes a massive pipeline play. Because if I can watch these compounds go up and down, and here's new data emerging, and this is interesting, and let me check out this one, I can watch this as a big pharma player. And if I find an asset interesting, let's say the asset that you described currently has a market value now of, let's say, 50 million, and we know it needs to raise much more to go further. And let's say now a big pharma company X comes in, or even a larger biotech company. I mean, even for like a mid-sized biotech company, those are relatively small amounts. They can now come in and they would buy the SPV. So that means they say, cool, here's a takeover offer. We're going to buy this asset it's currently trading at 50 million. We'll buy it for 60, the whole thing. And then the current, let's say, shareholders or token holders would need to accept that. And then they can cash out. So then the buyout would go to the SPV. SPV would redistribute money to shareholders, would dissolve itself, and give the ownership of the patents or the IP would flow to the buyer. And I also think that's a very clean model, because buyers can come in and make these offers and take assets off the system and then continue developing it. Over time, we hope to develop enough liquidity that maybe our system could start bringing assets to market in an entirely new way. But I think that's very far into the future still.
I have one question from the audience. It's Kira Borchardt.
Hi, Kira.
Hi, Kira.
Okay, so I did not quite understand where comes the liquidity from. So I do understand if there's an exit. Okay, but if there is no exit yet, so how does the startup get liquidity here?
Yeah, great question. So, and it's one of the, I think the most, and you always have to say this as a startup, one of the most challenging things that we're going to have to overcome is building initial liquidity. And the liquidity really comes from the network that we're building around this. So let's say if we manage to onboard 100 business angels that are interested in investing into new therapeutics for mental health. And each of those business angels has, let's say, 100K in liquidity. Then the collective would be the potential liquidity for a startup to raise through our system. You can extrapolate that a little bit further once there's active markets that are being traded. That those active markets essentially represent the liquidity that could potentially be available for someone to raise successfully. And let's say out of those 100 business angels, 5 decide to invest into that startup. That's essentially where the liquidity comes from. You can think in a similar way of like, if I list my company on the stock exchange, where does the liquidity come from? It would be the market participants collectively that would provide partially provide that liquidity.
I have another question actually surrounding also IP matters, because unfortunately this is sort of my background. So basically, on the one hand, when you speak about IP strategy, so you sort of, oh, we'll have a look at the IP strategy and put one around it. What do you mean by saying that?
Also a good question. With the IP strategy, we try to follow the playbook that Biotech has today, because ultimately the assets will only be successful if they have a sound IP strategy. And the IP strategy should essentially ensure that if the asset ever makes it to market, it can be commercialized as efficiently as possible for that specific indication. And that could result in defining what kind of patents to pursue around this, defining when to file them, which is always a big question. It's often better to file like later rather than filing too soon. Those could all be elements of the strategy. And for example, ensuring sometimes with assets, or sometimes there is no IP strategy, and it's important for a researcher to understand that, sorry, this is not going to be possible, or you're going to have to find other ways to finance this, which is often like a shame if, for example, in the repurposing space, there's amazing drugs that could be repurposed, and we've had lots of conversations, but there's simply no IP strategy that we can build. And then it's very hard to get investment for that. There are certain trademarking strategies that you can look into, for example. There's quite interesting new things that have emerged around exemptions in the United States in the repurposing space. But yeah, so those would all be things that we would consider.
Okay. And the other thing is also, so when you speak about research, I assume you often refer to academic researchers. And in my opinion, or my experience, I've worked with many, many academic researchers in the past, is that they sort of like to circumvent the tech transfer offices. And sort of, and when I think then about, okay, you're having then this asset, you want to develop it further, and suddenly, and let's say, okay, you have tokenized it now, and 5 years down the line, they look super successful, and suddenly the university comes like, hey, but this was actually our IP ownership. So how do you go about resolving that, or what kind of safeguards do you have in place that you will not get into this situation later on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that needs to be super clear. Just having very clear out licensing agreements with universities. And that's also a massive pain point that we've kind of identified as we went deeper into the space, that for example, many universities have their own licensing agreements that they set up in the 80s or 90s. And it's the same template that's been handed from person to person to person. And that's extremely frustrating to buyers. Because often it can take it. I mean, for some of the out licensing that we did, it took us over 12 months and to work with the tech transfer office to get it out licensed properly. And so something that we've also looked into is like, how do we standardize those agreements and just be able to say, look, you come onto our system, it's worked for these other people, these are the terms, and this is how it's going to work. And often especially if there is no patent yet, that can be quite nice for universities, because they're like, okay, we're essentially working for them. We want to help them do something with their IP. We don't want to take it. We're not like a pharma company that comes in and says, we're going to buy your asset. We want it as cheaply as possible. We want to help the researcher actually get funded and And that also works into a metric that the university typically has, which is like the number of startups that we create. So actually, like, yeah, working with tech transfer offices has been challenging, but also, yeah, there's massive improvement there, even at that level to make.
There are always different expectations from different tech transfer offices. And I like the point that you made, that it's sometimes seems to be handed down the terms from father to son, from mother to daughter for generations, with no changes. I think if you solve that, it's really one of the key points in the industry to standardize these processes, which I didn't want to touch into because it's really time and cost consuming. So while you're talking, I'm wondering what's the business model of Molecule? I mean, either you are a super rich Bitcoin billionaire who is has a philanthropic spark who wants to do that, or you're on the other side and have a business model established that you can use to fund your team, to fund the development of the infrastructure. How does it look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe my personal incentive to this goes really, really far back into like wanting to create a fair and much more accessible and transparent pharmaceutical development system. I think we could be so much further ahead and be doing so much better if we give people the right tools. And something that we really want to do with Molecule is give researchers and patients and the people that want to support them the right tools to make that happen. And it's really, I think, something that the industry hasn't worked on at all. I think that to some extent, if you look at how deals are made, they're extremely selfish, rather than thinking of the end user, which is always the patient. And so from a business model perspective, as a first step, we try to approach this as a platform as a service model. So essentially, if you join as a university, initially it's free. So you create a profile, you can say, cool, I want to list my project here. And then if we like the project, we start working with you. And then we try to operate on a success basis. So if we get your project successfully financed, or if it kind of successfully goes into a next stage, then we take a fee on that success. So again, comparing it to other marketplace models, we're not that different than a marketplace like Uber or Amazon, where like Amazon will take a small fee of every transaction. The other thing that we're super interested in is taking small equity stakes in the assets and royalty stakes. And that's a really interesting business model, I think, but it's something that only scales over the long term. And so, but that's something that really fascinates me. If we had 1,000 or 10,000 assets on our system, and we have a small stake in each of the assets, and it's a negligible stake. It's like a super small minority stake. Depending on our involvement, let's say if we set up the entity, if we set up the IP strategy, maybe you had some elements already, and then we're trying to move that into a model where you can just subscribe. You can be like, cool, I want this service and this service and this service, and it's going to cost me this much of my chunk in the end. But I think that's really exciting for Molecule actually to be exposed to all of the assets that are coming onto its system, and be exposed to their success. Because I think another thing that's often lacking is alignment in business models. Because if our business model is aligned with the success of our compounds, then we're aligned to make them work and make them successful. We're not aligned to just get out at the first kind of, where the first kind of money comes through the door. So first it's a success fee in a similar way as other marketplaces, then being exposed to the assets. And the last thing that I think is really interesting is having like premium data access models. So something that we haven't talked about is where would the data about these assets actually live? And the first step for us is to make the data ownership transferable, and for the asset ownership transferable, and for the assets to live on our system. The next step would actually be to add data around these assets through our systems as well. So I can almost like start accessing a data room about a specific molecule asset that I'm interested in. Now this data room is secure, and it's only for within the stakeholders, and it has to be, access to that has to be very restricted. But if I'm a big pharma company, it might be super interesting for me to have access to this data. And for the owners, it might be interesting for a big pharma company to actually look at that data because they might be interested to ultimately sell it. And so as a next step, you could start developing these data access models where, let's say, I pay a bulk fee to get access to all of this data from a fixed set of compounds. That's kind of a longer term business model that we're thinking about as well, especially I think as what we're doing becomes more interesting to enterprises.
So you mentioned just briefly that you actually would be interested in taking equity of these of the companies of these underlying assets. So why would you not take some of the tokens then?
Oh yeah, I mean same. I mean, I think
you're always wondering. So we're like, okay, we're talking about tokens here, and then suddenly, oh, it doesn't come up, but it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, with equity, I know equity is a form of ownership. Sorry, I meant that indirectly. Yeah, the model would. I mean, for us as a protocol, also the model will be much cleaner if our equity is all tokenized, and that's then also for us. The longer term thinking is exposing the owners of molecule to the underlying tokens that the protocol begins to own.
So for those that are not so familiar with blockchain technology, it basically means that researchers can go to your marketplace, ask you for support to assess their asset and to find funding for it. And this whole process initially for the researchers is for free, but if you successfully fund a project, you take a success fee and a little bit of the equity or / token. So basically it's no risk for the researcher. What happens if you are not successful in fundraising? Is there a special time period, or is there let's say a year that you can try to raise money and then you have to give everything back, or does the asset then sit forever at your platform? What is it might happen in future that some projects just not fundable. How does the researcher get out of the platform then?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a little bit of like a chicken and egg question. So at the moment we're only actually jumping through the hoops once we're sufficiently confident that we're going to be able to raise for the asset. And I mean, I think this is a similar thing in like the startup space a little bit. It's like when you want to start your own company and you don't have funding yet, you often wait until you actually press all of the founding documents buttons and put in that first capital until you have at least like 1 or 2 angels that are joining. Yeah, but our current process is we would only tokenize your asset and kind of go through that steps once first commitments are relatively clear, so that we don't end up in a state where we've launched your asset and then it becomes like a ghost.
What if I'm quicker? I mean, how do you handle your risk? Because the other scenario I have in mind is that I say, okay, I mean, go out on the market, raise funds. If you come back with an offer that's interesting to me, I will evaluate it. But at the same time, I use my network to try to be quicker. So it's risk reducing for me. I understand it. But it increases your risk. And this is real world behavior. It happens. How do you manage that? Do you demand exclusivity in the fundraising process, or do you just live with the risk?
Yeah, I mean, typically when we already get to, so for example, some of the out licensing agreements that we make have like almost like trigger clauses. So we out license it and we sign an agreement that says, cool, we have exclusivity over the asset and it's out licensed, but it only triggers once if the funding is raised up to a certain point. So it's almost like an option. And but at that point, it's relatively clear to the university that this is going to succeed, but you don't know, maybe tomorrow, like we're hit by, like, God forbid, like another economic crisis and the funding doesn't come together, then kind of that out licensing agreement can unwind again. And I also have to say, like, I think, Christian, your questions are fantastic, by the way, super, super in depth. We're also still in the process of kind of figuring it out as we go, which is really necessary. And depending on which university you work with, depending on which jurisdiction, if it's Copenhagen or if it's a university in Southern California, it's very different modus operandi. And but it's also something that we're trying super hard to get into a more streamlined process. Yeah.
No, it's very interesting, and congratulations that you take up the challenge. Think there is a lot of possibilities to get organized around that. There is one problem. So with the molecule, the technology is one issue to be solved. This is the job of the researcher. So they have to come up. It's nothing that you will do, I think. The second problem, and this is your sweet spot, is finding the funding of for the molecule. But then we have the third problem. The researchers at the university by nature are scientists who most often like doing basic research. But the early stage development is the part that's very much focused. It's development. You have to have a clear goal. You have to move forward, and you need a team.
Yeah.
Who brings the team to the table? Is that something that you want to do, or is that something that you hope somebody else is doing? Because very often when I talk with VCs and business angels, they are the ones who structure a team. So this is the asset that they bring on top of that to the table.
Yeah.
Is that also something that you have in mind for molecule, or do you want to restrict yourself only to the fundraising part?
No, it's definitely something that we have in mind. So what we don't, so first, when we look for assets, we try to only go with active assets. So we wouldn't work with we wouldn't want to like out-license a piece of IP from a university that has been sitting there for 3 years, and the PI that worked on it has already done 10 other projects. That's not really interesting. So we try to find active, very active projects. And then the second thing that you said, I think, is extremely important. I think it's not as important yet in that pre-seed stage where you kind of like, we need money for the killer experiment. Once we have the killer experiment, we'll figure out the rest. That's really where a big bottleneck is, I think. But then you're absolutely right. The next step is like executive management, project management, and then eventually business development to like do something with the asset, often like then broker an M&A deal. That's also a part that we still have to actively figure out how it's going to work well in this virtual framework. Right now, we're doing a lot of it, or we are bringing in advisors from our network to kind of help with that. Then you also have this natural development that it comes through the angels that, like as you mentioned, but it's not something where we have a tried and tested method yet.
I was wondering actually how you plan to scale this business, because it seems like at the moment there's a lot of consultancy work involved in it, and it's still. I wonder how many projects at the time you can really take on.
Yeah. Also a great point. So I think on the one side is by creating scalable frameworks where people enter information. Like as I mentioned earlier, I think that in itself is a big step by collecting the right amount of data from researchers and putting them into these frameworks. And so there you're already massively scaling the consultancy part. I don't need to explain to you why you should enter your budget in a way like this or this. It's just that's where the data field is, and that's where you can enter it. And then I think the other part is by staying relatively focused on this preclinical stage and not going into like stage 2 clinical trials where the managerial work is by magnitudes larger. I think that also helps, but it's not something that we have entirely figured out yet. And our hope is that like once we get to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 projects that are launched, and then to 10 projects that are launched, that a lot of these steps start becoming much more scalable. And the other hope is that once we see this already with some projects specifically in the longevity space, or also interesting in the psychedelic space, where there you have very strong investor communities and very strong ties to researchers, and it's a much more fluid exchange of information and building together than you would typically find, let's say, in oncology research. And so the last part is of scale. How do we scale this as a team? Is building in community-driven mechanisms that can help bring these things along more quickly.
How do actually government agencies or government funding agencies think about it? Because if I think, for example, in the UK, the largest one is the Wellcome Trust, and they have a very strong scheme of vetting potential drug development projects. Have you actually had any dialogue with such bodies, and how do you react to that if you say like, oh, there could be some tokens involved in this and might display the value of the asset? Are they open in general to such models, or are they still like holding up on it?
We had quite a few conversations initially. Like, I mean, this is already like over a year ago, and then realized, I think for them this will become quite interesting once it's at scale, because organizations like the Wellcome Trust want to deploy capital. I mean, they have an obligation to deploy their capital, but again, it's a funnel problem. It's like, do they make a grant program and then hundreds of researchers write them? Do they pick the researchers? And through a system like us, what we could do, kind of this concept that I described earlier, we could say, hey, let's pick 10 projects on Molecule that are fundable. They have to meet these 5 criteria. These 5 criteria are things that we just automatically can collect the data on. Like, do you meet the criteria, yes or no? Done. And then we can say, cool, Wellcome Trust, we have 5 projects here that are investable. And Wellcome Trust says, cool, we've gone through the data. They all match the criteria. We trust the people that looked at them. And we're going to bulk deploy capital automatically through your system into these 5 projects. And you could obviously scale that up to 20 projects. And then you could say, the Wellcome Trust wants to invest into 10 projects in the oncology space, or they want to invest into fighting, let's say, tropical diseases, financing 5 malaria projects. So you can make the whole thing, then you can scale it up. And I think that's when it becomes quite interesting for these types of organizations.
I mean, during my coaching education, there was a very interesting question. It's the wonder question. So it's, I think there are many problems on the market that you try to solve. But let's just assume what a wonder happens, and overnight all problems are solved and Molecule is up and running and has millions of investors and researchers on the platform. I think the value that you could bring, and this is the question or the statement that popped up in my mind, is the transferability, I do see, could really go down, because every researcher, every service provider could go on your platform. It would not be dependent on large-scale investments. So, for example, Charles River Laboratories or ILCP in Prague, or any university who has an experiment that would create data that adds value to the molecule, could secure the rights by purchasing these tokens, conduct at own risk the research, but they don't need to invest billions or millions. They probably need to invest a few thousand euros or a few 100,000 euros to get sufficient right to have a repayment, and then they can put it on the market once they have produced the data and sell it to the next part in the chain. Is this the right understanding of your vision, or did I miss something in the conversation?
No, absolutely. So I mean, what I really like about your thinking here is that you're starting to like play around what type of behavior or incentives or business models that this could actually enable. And to play your idea a bit further, so one part of the systems that we've begun designing, and it partially came through a collaboration that we have with a robotics CRO in Oxford. It's a company called Arcturus. And what they have is they essentially do completely automated preclinical experiments in a robotics lab, and they upload it straight to the cloud, which is super cool if you think about it. And so we started thinking about, cool, how can CROs interoperate with the system? And so let's say you're a researcher, you've just raised 300K in funding through our system. It's really early. And now you say, you know what? We need to have toxicology reports done. We need mouse studies. All this stuff is going to cost money. But what if we offer equity to people? So you could say, cool, I'm going to give 2% of the tokens to whoever does toxicology reports for me. And I don't have them yet. I'm still working on something else. And we don't even have the money for the tox reports or the mouse studies, but maybe someone will come along and do it. And then let's say a CRO in India says, we've been looking at this problem case, and actually this compound is really interesting to us. We will do this for those 2% plus maybe 10% in cash. And you could have an Australian CRO come and also say, cool, we also want to do this. And so now what you're starting to do is you're starting to exchange tokens for work. So rather than saying just take in money, you can also say, give me data and I'll give you a part of the asset because I'm only raising money to produce the data. So if you can give me the data straight away and do it on a more risky basis, that's quite interesting. I think for CROs, that value proposition is quite difficult because they need to spend a lot. It's quite expensive to do experiments. But for example, there are CROs that are changing their risk model around this and actually wanting to benefit from the upside that might come from the research that they're doing. And the interesting thing again here about tokens is that this is exactly the same, like it's the same underlying mechanism.
Yeah, but it took gain an understanding slowly. So when then the end point of the process is also solved, that the pharma company or a larger VC can take it off the platform without the need to having to negotiate with hundreds or potentially thousands of people, then it would be very valuable, because this is also one problem that I experienced, that is from the next step of the out-licensing part, from the company to the pharma industry or from the company to a VC, too many shareholders in a company are a blocking problem. Yeah. So when you hand out now percentages of tokens, can you make sure that you can transfer all ownership rights without the owners of the token intervening? How do you handle this problem?
Yeah, in the initial designs that we have, we mirror a lot of normal corporate governance functions to answer these questions. So again, I think with these kind of corporate governance things, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. But yeah, I mean, you could auto code this in. You could say, cool, a certain amount of token holders have to vote, and then it becomes binding for the rest of them. I think that's a relatively simple way to go about it.
So basically, it would be a simple vote. You implemented 50%. When 51% say yes, the asset goes to the buyer at the offered price without any further negotiation. So it's a clear structure. It's 2 weeks 2 weeks of voting, and either you take it or you leave it out. So it's basically simple.
For example.
Cool. Sounds great. Sounds like a great idea. I think it will take some time to convince the world.
100%. I mean, I think the vision that we're trying to go for is extremely ambitious. I think in some parts it's outright like it's a bit crazy, but I think you need to have that kind of mentality if you really want to make big changes to the system. Yeah.
I mean, we have a little bit of an audience with the podcast. So, what are the problems that you are currently working on, and what kind of support are you looking for at the moment?
Yeah, so the problems that we're currently working on are, I think we're seeing very solid, let's say, product market fit with our offering on the supply side, especially with academia and with drug discovery centers. And we could start having more help in how we're working with a few biotechs, but really scaling up, working with larger biotechs, and really just maybe kind of jamming with them on like, what does work for you? What does it mean for you? Would you be open to kind of like spinning out one of your assets? Where do you see the risks? Or where might be the risk for your shareholders? There's even questions like, what does it do to your accounting? Like if you held now tokens in an asset that you spun out, and there's things like that. But then I think the biggest challenges for us are on the demand side. And the demand side can be tricky because there's very different investor communities, and different assets have different investor communities. So example, oncology assets for breast cancer, you would find a very different investor base than say a novel psychedelic compound to treat a mental health issue. So narrowing down on those investor communities and then making sure that our value proposition really matches what they're looking for. Initially, we spoke to many biotech VCs and we realized, hey, we're like way too early in the funnel to be talking to people that want to allocate 5 to 10 million. And kind of getting that part of the equation right, and then also scaling up onboarding and marketing around that. The other thing where we continue to be, where all of your listeners might be super helpful is we're always looking for support. We're hiring at the moment for a variety of roles, and yeah, could really use more support from the core biotech ecosystem. Yeah, those are some of the things at the top of my mind. Oh, and then obviously any feedback. Christian, I'll be happy to send you kind of a link to kind of our current system, and if any of your listeners want to sign up and give us feedback, like we'd be super stoked. If they understand it, what is happening here, does this make sense? Yeah.
This would be a great thing to get the link to have access to your platform. We can add it to the podcast episode and send it also through the newsletter. And if anybody's interested, they can look at it. Astrid, do you have further questions?
No, I think it's been a really interesting conversation, and I'll be looking forward to seeing, how Molecule will evolve over the next few years and how it will all pan out. I think it's a very interesting concept. Room for more improvement here and there, but that's the thing with, doing cutting edge technology and working on new business models. But it's been really fascinating. So thanks very much for being on the show, Paul.
Thank you so much, Astrid. It's been a pleasure.
No, I also think it's a very interesting idea, and there is a problem actually in this phase that you're aiming at, and I think it's an unsolved problem. So if your system works and if you have the guts, the nerves, and the willpower to push through these adversities that probably your team will face, I believe you can bring a lot of value to that part of the industry, and I would be happy if you succeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. Please share the podcast and make sure you've subscribed. Have a great day.